I'm back, Miss Brock and Miss Broccoli, and we're having some summer fun, and I hope you're turning off the TV after this, and I hope you're reading books, or getting off the screen and reading lots of books. So if you've listened to me in the past, you know Patricia Polacco is one of my favorites, and I have 2 books by her here, and they're both pretty lengthy, so I'm just going to read Miss Mack, this one. And you know, the thing I love about Patricia is that she writes her stories and she draws her pictures, okay? So if you're like me, this summer you spent a lot of time at day camps. Maybe you went to like Created for a Purpose. That's what I'm at this week. Or maybe you came to one of my pottery camps or Miss Pam's art camps or the city's camps or just all the camps that are going on. The VBSs, we've had so many different ways to spend our days. But this one is an overnight camp. And a lot of you don't get the chance to go to that, but I'm going to read you a story, and it's kind of like more than like a week. So it's kind of a special overnight camp, and it's called Patricia Polacco, Mrs. Mack. To Bernie, the woman who taught me about horses and people, with love. It was the summer of my 10th year. I was spending it with my dad in Michigan, just as I had since I was 4. My brother Richie, my dad, and I were talking on the porch, gnawing on sweet corn and watching fireflies shimmer up from the newly mowed grass. Dad grew usually quiet, thoughtful, then leaned back against the porch step, loosened his belt and sighed. Yes, sir, I think it's going to be the summer, Patricia. I waited for the longest time for the next word, searching his face for a clue. This is the summer that you're going to learn to ride. My heart leapt in my chest because Dad knew my special dream of having a horse of my very own and learning to ride. Learning to ride this summer meant only one thing. He was going to get me a horse. When, Dad? I managed to squeal, and I turned cartwheels for the pure excitement of it all. He fell forward. Tomorrow. How's that, my little filly? Tomorrow. The next morning, as Richie packed for summer camp, I put on my new riding clothes that Mama had got me from San Francisco, just in case. After all, this was the day I was going to get my own horse. After we dropped Richie off for the bus to camp, Dad headed down the highway towards Lansing, a college town, my mother called it, because the university was there. Where are we going, Dad? I asked, barely able to contain my excitement. Maybe the stable would be somewhere near the college. You'll see, he sang out as he drove along. I tried to imagine what the horse would look like. I wondered if it would be anything like the one I'd always dreamed of. Maybe I'd never have to go to those dumb old pony ride places where the pony was led around in a circle by a huge metal wheel like a tiny merry-go-round that wasn't really riding. When we got to Lansing, Dad drove by the college, past the city center and Potter's Park. And when he finally started to slow, I looked out the window. The houses were run down. Some of them were even shacks. I realized that we were in Dog Patch, the roughest part of town. Dad had made a terrible mistake. There couldn't be any horses here. Then we stopped in front of the most shabby-looking stable I'd ever seen. A horse trailer was right next to it, and a shack had a sign on it that said office. A couple of really tough-looking kids leaned out against the hitching rail beside the 2 tired-looking horses. I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes. Dad wasn't going to get me a horse at all, and I didn't want to get out of the car. But Dad took my hand, so I did. The woman with the snakeskin boots. We stood there for a while. My eyes took everything in. What an awful place, I thought. It was dirty and unfriendly, and there was real mean-looking old man leaning over the fence next to the door, spat on the ground and mumbled something. You kids seen Mrs. Mack? My father finally asked one of the tough-looking kids. Just as they were about to answer, a old 1952 Impala rattled up in front of and sputtered to a stop. I'd never seen so much dust on a car in my life. The only clear spot was on the windshield, where the wipers had made a pass across it. I leaned over and looked inside. I saw a woman with high cheekbones and a broad smile and with one overlapping front tooth, just like mine. She had glistening blue eyes and tousled her brown hair that fell up to her shoulders. I felt her eyes drink me in. We breathed together for a moment. Hey, sugar, you must be Pat, she said in such a deep Southern accent that she made it sound like Pate, not Pat. Patricia, my dad announced. This is Miss Mack. She's forgotten more about horses than most people ever know in a lifetime, he said with genuine admiration. The woman, she had on snakeskin boots, got out of the car and walked over to two of the kids. "Pat, meet Donnie and Nancy," she said. Their eyes looked at me and looked me up and down. "Show Pat around," Miss Mack said as she pushed me towards them. "That's one fancy outfit. Where'd you come from anyways? Hollywood?" the boy said as we walked back to the stalls. I could feel my face flush. He nudged the girl and they both laughed. I didn't belong here. Why had my dad brought me here? I didn't like these kids at all, and they sure didn't like me. And there was that old man. He was watching us again. He didn't look like any friendlier than he did before. We walked from stall to stall. Nancy and Donnie told me the names of the horses. Salty, Buster, Lady, Pal. But all I could remember anything they were saying, I couldn't remember anything they were saying because I felt so out of place. Then Nancy jumped on the fence rail. I climbed up too. "That one there is Apache," she said, pointing to the horse in the corral. "A strawberry Appaloosa, Miss Mack's horse. Almost nobody rides him besides her. The only one other horse in the stable is as good as Apache," Donnie said, pointing to the black holding pen. "And no one rides her, though," Nancy said. I squinted into the pen. There, standing in the broken sunlight, was the most beautiful animal I'd ever seen in my life. This one's Penny," Nancy said, none too friendly about it. "Ain't she grand?" Donnie asked, as he had forgotten if I was there. But he was right. My eyes followed her contours. She was perfect. A beautiful buckskin mare with black socks. Her closely cropped mane rode up her arched neck to a full top crop. Her tail was short, but she held it as if it had been set up for like a fancy horse show. She stood there almost motionless. As the sun danced through the leaves of the overhanging tree, her coat shone like a bright copper penny. The horse took a step and her muscles danced through her legs. She looked right at me with her beautiful, intelligent eyes. Her ears cut forward as she made a whuffing sound that ripped through her nostrils. This is the one, I thought. She was everything that was beautiful about a horse. She was a dream. And suddenly it didn't matter I was in Dogpatch or that these kids didn't like me. Nothing mattered to me anymore except having the chance to be there with Penny. For the rest of that day, I just stood and watched the bustle that went around me. Donnie and Nancy ignored me. They took renters on trail rides. Whenever they returned, they went to the office to have a coffee. I felt useless. I started to feel lonely, especially when Miss Mack left to pick up the new bridles. I found myself going back to where Penny was and standing, looking at her, and dreaming of a time that I might be good enough to ride her. When Dad came to pick me up after work, I didn't say much. But the next morning, I was up bright and early and ready to go. I wore my jeans and a t-shirt, this time no ribbons or rhinestones. "Hey, Hollywood," I heard Donnie call out as we arrived. "You look like one of us today." He smiled. I smiled back. But Nancy bolted over between us. "She's never going to be one of us. Too soft." Then she handed me a pitchfork. "Here, clean the manure in number 3, 6, and 8 stalls. When you're through with those, curry Pal and Butch. Someone put them away last night without cooling them down and brushing them." Where's Miss Mack, I wondered. I shoveled the pitchfork, curried, swept, and cleaned. Sweat dripped down my chin, but I finished my chores before Nancy and cleaned more stalls. "Not too bad for a city girl," she sneered. Just then I felt a strong hand in the middle of my back. It was Miss Mack. "Nice job," she said. She looked at me. "Okay, sugar, let's get you started on a horse today." "Am I going to ride?" I stammered, feeling a little afraid. "You sure are," she answered. "By myself?" "All by yourself." Meet Pal. Pal is the gentlest horse I have. "I wouldn't put you on anything you weren't ready for, sugar," Miss Mack assured me the next day as I stepped in her hand and threw my leg over Pal's back. The saddle seemed hard and unbelievably small. The ground looked miles below me. "Keep your heels down. Sit back up in the saddle. Ease the reins gently in the direction you want to go." Miss Mack kept talking to me. Finally, she led Pal across the road to a large corral. Every step Pal took seemed to rattle my bones. Next thing I knew, Miss Mack opened the gate and let go of Pal's bridle, and I was alone. Donnie and Nancy came in too, and for the first time in my life, I was riding a horse alone. Wasn't attached to a wheel. "Keep your hands soft, Pat," Miss Mack called out from the fence. "And don't hang on to the saddle horn, Hollywood," Donnie said, and grinned at Nancy, and she trotted around me. They rode so well, I could feel my tears again. Just then I heard Miss Mack's voice. "You look like you were born on the back of a horse, sugar." I felt the sun shining on my face, and I could almost feel my heart beating, keeping time with Pat's plodding steps. One day, I would leave that corral and be good enough to ride on the trail. I would. Every day for a whole week, I rode good old Pal in the corral, and by the end of the first week, I'd learned how to put a bridle on him, saddle him, and even how to back him up. But then one day I was riding Pal across the street. He lurched sideways. I lost my balance and I fell off. I struggled to hang on to the reins, so Pal was just dragging me along. "It's okay, Hollywood," Donnie was saying as he took the reins and clenched my fist when Pal finally stopped. His voice was soft and soothing. This happens to us all. Even Nancy helped me get off to the ground. "One thing you got to do is get back on that horse and ride him around the corral one more time, even if you can taste the fear," she said. They were both smiling at me for the first time. I swallowed the fear, got back on, and rode Pal around the corral 3 more times. Miss Mack was standing with Donnie and Nancy. A huge round man came bustling across the street stable and stood next to her. He had messy red hair and a huge mustache and red cheeks and a crooked cigar wedged between his front teeth. I found out later he was Doc Beck, the best darn veterinarian in all Michigan. As the days passed into weeks, I graduated from Old Pal. I rode Buster, a stocky bay, and Taffy, a pretty buckskin. Miss Mack even let me go out on short trail rides with Donnie and Nancy on Salty. And one day she paired me up with Nancy and a paying customer, and I got to go out on the trail. By the end of every day, I always went into the holding pens where Penny was to kiss her goodbye. I'd climb onto the stall with her, pull up an overturned bucket, and sit there with her. Sometimes she'd plunge her muzzle into the top of my head and muss up my hair. Sometimes she whiffled and sniffed my ears with her nostrils. Most of the time, we'd just sit there together. I longed to ride her. It would be an answer to a nightly prayer. One day as I arrived to the stables, Miss Mack announced the next horse I'd ride would be Duke, normally Donnie's mount. Miss Mack thought I was good enough to try him. First, I rode him into the corral. We all did with the first mount. Miss Mack watched carefully. And when I was sure I could handle him, she let me go out on the trail with Donnie and Nancy. We were coming back from the ride, crossing the busy street near the stables, when a car came out of nowhere. Duke reared and lurched off his neck wrench and the reins from my hand. He broke into a canter, then a dead run. I had lost control. I was on a runaway horse with no way to stop him. Duke kept running faster and faster, and I tried to reach down for the flailing reins only to lose my balance and nearly fall off. Finally, I got a hold of one of them, and as I pulled as hard as I could, this made Duke run in a circle, and the circle got smaller and smaller until he slowed enough for me to reach to the other rein and stop him. When I got back, I put Duke away, and I went to Penny's pen. I climbed the fence next to her. She whiffled and came close to me. I put my arm around her. The tears rolled down my neck. Through the tears, I could see a figure watching me from over the fence. It was the old man. I looked away. I didn't want him to see me crying. I heard Miss Mack's voice say, "It's all right, Hap. I'm here with her now." I looked up, and she was talking to the old man. He turned and went towards his house, and then she hugged me. "Every time I think I know a horse, something happens," I sobbed. "Sugar," she said softly, "that's how you learn. The more of them you ride, the more experience you have, and the better rider you'll be." "There's so much I don't know," I cried. "Never feel like you know it all. That's when you can get hurt. I'll never be the rider I want to be." Miss Mack looked at me intently into the eyes. "Duke ran away with you, but you did exactly the right thing. You stayed with the saddle. You got to hold one of the reins. You pulled him into the circle. I never told you to do that. You're a natural, Pat, a natural." Just then, Penny came over to us, nudged my back with her head, and Miss Mack looked surprised. "How often do you come to this corral with Penny, Pat?" she asked. "All the time I can," I answered. "She doesn't take to people easily." Her voice trailed off. I heard a door slam, and the man next door had gone inside. "Do you know that old man, Miss Mack?" I asked. "I can't say that I know him, but I know why he's here and the way he is." "Seems like he watches me all the time when I work," I said. "He probably admires you, how hard you work to master riding. He, more than anyone, understands hours and hours of practice. He was a flyer with the Ringling Brothers Circus. He's a trapeze artist." "That old man? What happened to him?" "One night during a performance, he missed a catch and dropped his brother. There was no net." "Did he fall?" "Just like that." "That's it. He didn't. His brother did, and he died from the fall. Hap blames himself, so now he's crippled. See, crippled up inside, Pat." The next morning, when I came to the stables, I brought a sack of molasses cookies that my grandmother had made. I put them near Hap's back door and waited by the stable door until I saw him collect them and take them into his house. From that day on, the cookies were as much as a part of my morning as visiting sweet copper Penny. And one day, when the blacksmith came to shoe her, Penny hated being shod, so I stayed near her to assure her. He pounded extra shoe ring nails into rings for us kids. I asked him if he made a larger one for my dad, but instead of giving it to my dad, I put the ring next to a bag of cookies that I left at Hap's door. A beautiful copper penny. You're doing good. I got about 5 more pages. Each day passed, and the summer was coming to an end. I yearned to ask Miss Mack just once if I could get on Penny's back. One rainy day, I'd almost summoned enough courage to approach her when Miss Mack asked me to go to the mill with her for food. We climbed into her impala and sat off. We didn't talk for a time. We just rode. Then she said, "Have you ever wondered how you ended up here in the dog patch with the rest of us?" "My dad brought me here," I answered. "No, sugar, you ended up here because of a love that burns like fire in your belly, the love of horses. Your pa knew that I loved them the same way as you do. So he hooked us up," she smiled. "Not everybody has that kind of feeling for those animals, you know." Her voice trailed off. I knew exactly what she meant. "They know too, Pat, the horses. They know when they're around a pure soul that loves them. They can feel it in your hands. They can see it in your eyes, and they can sense it in your heart." I just looked at her. I wonder how she knew so much of my secret feelings. "That's why I brought you here. That's what brought Donnie and Nancy here, and all the other kids have come to my stables." I smiled at her. I hadn't wanted to come to Dog Patch ever, and I hadn't wanted to know Donnie or Nancy. They were too different. But we were more alike than different. I knew that now. Then we just sat there together in the old Impala, and it felt good to be sitting there loving horses in that car with Miss Mack. It was the very sunny Friday when it happened. I arrived at the stables like always, but something was different. I knew it. I was getting a new mount, and usually Donnie or Nancy would bring the new horse to me, but today Miss Mack went to get it, and Donnie and Nancy and I waited by the hitching post. I wondered which horse Miss Mack was going to bring. Maybe her horse, Apache. But when I finally saw the look on Donnie and Nancy's face as they looked behind me, I knew it must be Apache. I could hear Miss Mack talking in a soft voice to the horse. But when I turned around, I saw it was not Apache, it was Penny. I couldn't breathe for a whole minute. Miss Mack handed me the reins with her eyes kind of a watery light. I drew up the reins and mounted without a word. I felt as though time had stopped and the air wasn't moving. It even seemed like the birds were washing. "You made it, Hollywood," Donnie said softly as he smiled. Nancy nodded and gave me a thumbs up. I felt my heart connect with Penny. Her body quivered, and she waited for a signal for me to tell her what to do. I touched her sides with my knees, and Penny responded, just almost jumping out from underneath me. I reined her in quickly. My heels were down, my tail was tucked, and under the reins tightly in my finger. I remembered everything I'd been taught. It was second nature now. "Take her in the corral for a few turns before you head out, Pat," Miss Mack called to me. She sat on the fence rail and watched Penny intently. Penny seemed to be like part of me. As I moved, she moved. Her thoughts were mine, and we moved like dancers or ice skaters together. I felt elegant and graceful on her, and as I passed from each person at the fence, I caught eyes. Even old Hap was there, and when I pulled up in front of Miss Mack, my mouth formed the words, "Thank you." Miss Mack opened the gate and waved us towards the trail. We trotted through the gate, then paused. Penny reared, and I threw my hand over her head like a cowboy. My heart was singing. Just then, a leaf blew across the road in front of us, a single leaf. Penny stopped so suddenly that she leapt to the left. I lost my balance and fell from her back so hard to the ground. I held onto the reins. She dragged me for a few feet. I fought back the tears and the feelings of disappointment and terror. When Penny finally stopped, I slowly stood up, dazed. My back hurt. Everyone watched me. I started to lead Penny back to the stables when I heard Miss Mack shout out, "No, Pat, get back on that mare. Get on it now." I couldn't. I suddenly was afraid of Penny. I was afraid of her. "Get back on, Pat," Miss Mack said. My tailbone hurt so much that I could hardly walk, but I knew Miss Mack was right. I had to get back on her. My heart was pounding, and I came up beside Penny's neck. "There, girl," I said to myself. I gathered the reins, turned the stirrup, stepped into it, flung myself back in the saddle. I leaned into Penny's withers. I shivered for a moment. I caught my breath, then she leaned back into me, and I knew she had forgiven my inexperience. She was willing to try again. I sat straight in the saddle. Penny arched her neck and held her tail high. She reared slightly, her hooves dancing under my weight. My breath caught, and she stumbled on the ridge of the middle of the road. But after that, her steps were sure and proud. A touch from my knee, she broke into an elegant trot. Another, she broke into a rocking canter. I found myself laughing out loud for the sheer pleasure of being on Penny's back. Everyone around the corral started to clap, even old Hap. As I cantered by him, I could see the grin. Donnie and Nancy cantered up to me. We exploded down the road together, the three of us. There's got to be something. The air seemed to be getting a little cooler in the mornings. I arrived at the stable. I knew I had to go back to California for school with my mom soon. I relished the days that were left to Penny and me. We were never apart. Even the neighborhood kid would call her name out when we trotted by. The smell of burning leaves drifted through the limbs of the trees. I was happier than I'd ever been, and sadder at the same time. One day at lunch, I burst into tears. No one tried to console me because they all felt the same way. This had been a glorious summer, and I was going to miss Penny so much. I finally choked out, "I'm going to miss her." "She'll miss you too, sugar," Miss Mack said as she took my hand, "and I don't want her to be lonely. Who will brush her every day? Who will hug her? Who will tell her how much they love her?" I cried. "I will, sugar," Miss Mack said quietly. Nancy pointed to a worn photo tacked at the back of the wall. It was of a meadow. "She'll go up north to Ashley to stay with Miss Mack's farm and the other horses," Nancy told me. "Farm?" I questioned. "I didn't know you had a farm," I said to Miss Mack. Prettiest place you'll ever see," Donnie said. So the tiny trailer she lived in here wasn't Miss Mack's only home? It was a moment that I realized that Miss Mack chose to be in Dog Patch with the horses and the kids. Maybe because of the kids. I looked at her and Donnie and Nancy without another word, and we stood there and hugged each other for the longest time. Some mornings later, it was overcast and dark, and I arrived at the stables. I saw Donnie and Nancy waiting for me. Doc Beck's truck parked in front. Something was wrong. My heart stopped in my chest. I knew it was Penny. I ran to the back of the lot where her stall was, found her down. Doc Beck was leaning over her, holding a mirror next to her nostril, and a trickle of blood was running out of her nose. "Oh, Doc," was all I managed to squeeze out. He stroked her neck. "A viral infection of some kind, Pat. If we can't get her to her feet, it's going to go certainly to pneumonia." "Oh, God, please, please, please," were the only words that came to my heart, and it was pounding. "This isn't good, Pat. When animals this size lie down with an ailment like this, their lungs fill with blood and fluid, and she'll drown in her own blood if we can't get her to her feet." I sank to my knees, and I pulled my head into my lap. Her only hope was for us somehow to suspend her so she can stand, and right now she can't support her own weight. "Let's try to get her up. We have to," I screamed. She needs a Springer sling," Doc Bailey said thoughtfully, "and we don't have one. We have one at the college," Doc Beck, where I taught. "We could send Ann Arbor, but it would take hours, and we don't have that kind of time. We have to try," I sobbed. "I'm sorry," Doc Beck said. "Pat, sugar," Miss Mack pleaded. Penny rattled, and she struggled to breathe. Her lungs were already filling, her eyes looked dim and full of pain. I watched Doc Beck fill a huge syringe. "She's suffering otherwise, Pat," Donnie was saying through his own tears. Nancy rocked to her knees. I'm so sorry, Pat." She started sobbing so hard that the drool fell in ribbons from my mouth. "Miss Mack," I said between sobs, "will you take her to the farm and bury her there? Promise me?" She squeezed my hand. I knew she would. Doc Beck took the needle and held it up to the light and the fluid in it. He moved towards Penny. I closed my eyes and held her head next to my heart. Then the stable door swung open. We looked up. It was Hap. "Donnie told me," he said gruffly. "Well, you ain't tried everything yet." "Hap, there's nothing to be done," Doc Beck cautioned him. "That sling Donnie said you needed, I think I can make it out of this." He pulled out a huge canvas bag through the stable door. "It's my rigging, Bernice," he said to Miss Mack. "My rigging from the circus. Got more in the shed if you need it." Doc Bailey smiled and pulled open the bag. There's certainly apparatus here that we might be able to use all right." Everyone sank to their knees and pulled Hap's rigging out into the floor. I'd never seen so many ropes, pulleys, brass fittings, and wide pieces of leather in my life. Miss Mack was looking up from a crossbeam above the stall. "This beam will hold her weight," she said. Miss Mack and Doc and Hap with help worked as fast as they could to make a sling. "A perfect Springer sling," Doc Beck finally said. And then we managed to ease the rigging around Penny's withers hindquarters, and we pulled. But it was no use. We didn't have enough strength to get her to her feet. "Get up, girl. Get up, my beautiful copper Penny," I pleaded, but Penny did not move. I stopped begging out loud. Instead, I thought as hard as I could. "Please, baby, please," I said in my heart. Penny found my eyes. Her ears stood up. She whuffled. "That's my Penny, baby girl," I kept saying. She raised her head and struggled to roll, and when each roll, we pulled the ropes. And finally, she rolled onto her front legs, and then with a hearty groan, we gave one last push that brought her to both legs. She was weak, but she was up. We all stayed with her through the night, loosening the ropes bit by bit as she supported more and more of her own weight. Doc Beck stayed with her side all night. Her breathing became clearer and clearer, and he gave her more shots to help. But he kept listening to her chest with a stethoscope, and we kept searching his face. Near morning, he listened again. He snorted and puffed on his cigar for a moment, and then he beamed with a broad smile. "She passed this crisis," he announced. "This mare's going to be fine, just fine." Donnie and Nancy cried. Miss Mack kept patting their shoulders, saying, we did it. I noticed old Hap sneaking away like his quiet self. I ran over to him and tugged his hand. "Thank you, Hap, thank you," I cried. He hugged me. Tears ran down his old face. Miss Mack hugged both of us. The three of us seemed almost like we were one, and Hap turned to leave, but he simply put out one of his hands, pushed it up towards me and pointed to the horse now ring and smiled. When that summer ended, I wept bittersweet tears of my life, the most bittersweet tears of my life, the only to shed tears of pure joy when I went back to the little stable every summer for the next 7 years. Dog Patch and the folks there at the stable on the night of the crisis changed after that summer. Old Hap was a new man, and in time he took a wife and a widow and lived across the street, and he became known as a helpful, almost jolly neighbor there in Dog Patch. Donnie had his dream, too, to be a veterinarian like Doc Beck, and he went to veterinary school right there in Lansing. No one really helped him, but no one really knows who helped it, but we all have a good idea who we knew who. Donnie returned to Dog Patch long enough to marry Nancy, then moved to Shelbyville, Tennessee. Miss Mack gave Penny to me for my very own the next summer, and I kept Penny until I was 18 and went away to college. Then Dad returned Penny to Miss Mack and her farm in Ashland, Michigan.